Good evening. Tonight I thought I would begin with a reading about the use of drugs from Dr. Jung's perspective, because quite a number of you have asked about the use of drugs as a means to get through to the unconscious. And Dr. Jung felt that that was very dangerous. And so I'm going to read his statement about it. This is a statement that appears in the Houston Interviews, page 334 in C.G. Jung Speaks. But it is also, the Houston Interviews are also available on YouTube in YouTube version, so that you can see them for yourselves. So this came to me today, as a matter of fact, by synchronicity, from the Carl Jung Depth Psychology site.blog, and I receive emails from this site almost daily, and they bring me up to date on things that I should pay attention to. I often add them to our discussions. So, hi Art. I'm doing well. So tonight I'm going to begin with a reading of Dr. Jung's position on the use of drugs. And we can talk about it a little bit, and then I will move on to other matters, including psychology and alchemy. So this is from the Houston Interviews. You can find the Houston Interviews on YouTube and actually watch the interview with Dr. Jung, but this is an excerpt of it. Dr. Jung. Now, to pursue this a little further, another development that falls right into line with this whole discussion of psychosomatic medicine has been the use of drugs to deal with psychological problems. Let's see if I can... There. Is that better? Okay. A particular development has been the so-called non-addictive drugs, which began in France with lorpromazine, reserpine, serpentina, and a great variety of milder tranquilizers known by such trade names as Miltown and Equinol. They are now being administered very freely to patients by general practitioners and internists, not only to schizophrenics and others who are not approachable, but are being dispensed almost as freely as aspirin to reduce everyday tensions. It is very dangerous. Question: why do you think it is dangerous? They say these drugs are non-addictive. Mind you, we're reading, or he was being interviewed more than 50 years ago, more than 60 years ago. And so it's very timely for us now. So the questioner: why do you think it is dangerous? They say these drugs are non-addictive. Dr. Jung: it's just like the compulsion that is caused by morphine or heroin. It becomes a habit. You don't know what you are doing, you see, when you use such drugs. It is like the abuse of narcotics. Question: but the argument is that these are not habit-forming. They are not addictive, not physiologically. Dr. Jung: oh yes, that is what one says. Question: but you feel that psychologically there is still addiction? Dr. Jung: yes. There are many drugs that are not habit-forming like morphine, yet it becomes a psychic habit, and that is just as bad as anything else. Question: have you actually seen any patients or had any contact with individuals who have been taking these particular drugs, these tranquilizers? Dr. Jung: I can't say. You see, with us, there are very few. In America, you know, there are all those little tablets and powders. Happily enough, we are not yet so far. You see, American life is, in a subtle way, so one-sided and so... I'll have to skip that word because I don't know what it is. I can't pronounce it. Deracinus. And so uprooted that you must have something to compensate the earth. I'll read that sentence again without the word. You see, American life, in a subtle way, is one-sided and uprooted, that you must have something to compensate the earth. You have to pacify your unconscious all along the line because it is an absolute uproar. So at the slightest provocation, you have a big moral rebellion. Look at the rebellion of modern youth in America, the sexual rebellion, and all that. We're talking about the late 1950s here. The real natural man is just in open rebellion against the utterly inhuman form of life. You are absolutely divorced, you know, from nature in a way, and that accounts for the drug abuse. Question: but what about the treatment of seriously ill mental patients? We have the problem of hospitalized patients, the schizophrenics, manic depressives. Certain schizophrenics are so withdrawn that you can't deal with them. In many hospitals, they have been using drugs like chlorpromazine, and the patient comes back to reality for a short time. I don't think most of our practitioners believe the drugs cure the patients in themselves, but at least they make the patient more amenable to psychotherapy. Dr. Jung: yes, the only question is whether that amenability is a real thing or drug-induced. I am sure that any kind of suggestive treatment will have an effect because the patients simply become more suggestible. You see, any drug or shock undermines the moral stamina, making these people accessible to suggestion. And then they can be led. They can be made into something, but it is not a very happy result. Okay. So that's the end of that segment. And so I think that's pretty clear that Dr. Jung wasn't recommending the use of drugs, and I think if you're an American, very likely you have someone in your immediate circle who has died of an overdose in the last 2 or 3 years. I know in my circle, I have 2, and they're both young men. And it's truly tragic. And so it's something like the deaths that we were having in the Vietnam War, except more so because last year we had 72,000 people die from drug overdoses. And in the whole Vietnam War, we lost just over 58,000. So the drug problem in the U.S. is a very significant problem. It's mainly a problem because of physicians who give prescription drugs out too freely, and people who come up with excuses so that they'll do that. Let's see. Brian says, good evening, Skip. Excited that you're diving in Jung's view of more medical interventions. Fascinating topic. Thomas, I get the impression he is talking about prescription medicines from the drugs mentioned. Huxley made news around 1957, but I don't see him mentioned. The dangers of prescription drugs is still here, absolutely. Thomas says 480,000 deaths from tobacco, 88,000 from liquor, 70,000 from overdoses of all kinds of drugs, according to the CDC. Well, I don't doubt it, and of course tobacco is nicotine, and nicotine is drug, and I can't really say for liquor that's something else again. Okay, so the way I think I'm going to proceed with this process now is to hold this evening session on Monday evenings open for pretty much general discussion with some guidance. And so I'm going to use for guidance this book, Psychology and Alchemy by C.G. Jung. And last week I didn't have at my fingertips my review of this book, but I do have it now. So I am going to give you my review of Psychology and Alchemy so that you can go read it. This is from 4 years ago. So this is where I was 4 years ago on this. Last week, I apologize. I gave you my review of Answer to Job, and that was a bit more political than I wanted it to be. But what I've just given you is the link to Psychology and Alchemy review. Brian Knuckles says, scary fact, the 70,000 number is more than AIDS, gun violence, or car accidents at their peak year for context. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we were killing 50,000 people a year on the roads not long ago. We're still killing 35,000, but we have twice the population that we had then. So per capita automobile deaths are severely down, but they're very typically involved with alcohol, unfortunately. Thomas says, Wolfgang Pauli's connection with Jung is truly fascinating. Pauli's dreams, I think, are in Psychology and Alchemy. Yes, I intend to get to that because they represent a very interesting individuation. And Dr. Jung made the point that Dr. Pauli, who was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist and cosmologist, he did not have let's say, a social studies education. He had mainly a scientific, all rationality, all the time education, as you might guess from someone who's a PhD in physics, and especially back then, and we're talking around 1930 time frame when they were originally communicating. And Dr. Pauli started with Dr. Jung when he was 28. And Dr. Jung brilliantly had one of his disciples and apostles handle the initial analysis of Wolfgang Pauli. And he did that intentionally so that he wouldn't bring into the analysis any of his own predilections about alchemy. And the reason that's significant is that Dr. Jung had, at least 15 years before, maybe 20, had realized that the dreams that he was seeing in his clinic from his patients were the same as images that he had seen in alchemy. And so that got him curious. And in the late 19-teens, he started to develop a lexicon of alchemical words. The most famous one is solve and coagula. I guess it's solve et coagula. And because these fellows, for the 1700 years that alchemy was active, were all writing in Latin, because that was what you did in those days. And so Dr. Jung started to develop a lexicon of what they were saying, and over time, about a 10-year period, he developed a lexicon with about 20,000 terms in it, believe it or not. Can you imagine the commitment that it took to do that? And obviously he was doing other things in connection with alchemy over this time, but it made him the world's expert on alchemy and what was going on there. And what Dr. Jung and Wolfgang Pauli's work then meant was that it told Dr. Jung very clearly that the alchemists were actually early psychologists. Yes, they were early chemists, no doubt about that. And they may not have been very conscious that they were psychologists per se. But anyway, they did their work thinking that they were trying to tease out the spirit in matter. And so the part of their work that dealt with actually chemical processes ultimately got taken over by chemistry, of course. But Dr. Jung's discovery was that they were really early psychologists. And also he discovered in the process that also all religions are really early forms of psychology, and they're great systems for managing psychic problems. And so and I don't think that was readily apparent to many people. It certainly wasn't readily apparent to me 20 years ago, and based on, a typical middle-class American Christian education, I never really understood that we were really talking about psychology. Why? Because the theologians want to put everything outside of ourselves. And of course, that's wrong-headed. but that's a different story. And so solve and coagula is to dissolve and then recoagulate something into a new substance. And that's basically what we're doing in psychology. It's basically what we're doing on any given Monday night in this group, or on afternoons when I'm doing a reading, and some of you join me at that time. And after the reading, I sometimes do a Q&A. And what we're doing is we're dissolving your preconceived notions about the way your mind works and letting it come back together in a new way. So this is why Dr. Jordan Peterson says in one of his videos, "Oh my, if you read Jung, he'll rewire your circuits." Well, he certainly will, and he will ultimately rewire the circuits of all society, probably, and yes, I think that's right, Thomas. So he came to Emma Rosenblum first, maybe. And so anyway, the significance of that was that over a period of about 10 years, Pauli produced 1,000 dreams. And Jung finally looked at them and realized the connection between the alchemical symbols and the Pauli dreams, and he made a selection. I think there's about 55 of Pauli's most notable dreams, which are in this book, and we're referring to Psychology and Alchemy by C.G. Jung. And as you'll see from reading my review, this is really a history of the Western psyche from, earliest written times, from the beginning of the Bible, and which goes back at least to 1500 BC, if not earlier, and right up to the present day. So what Dr. Jung put in Psychology and Alchemy was really a history of the human mind. And there's a couple of other books that are a little easier to understand that also have it. One is the Origins of Consciousness, the History and Origins of Consciousness by Erich Neumann, who was a very close disciple. Some called him Jung's logician. But anyway, Erich Neumann was cloistered in Tel Aviv during World War II, where he could not communicate with anyone in the Jungian community. And during that period of time, he wrote a couple of seminal works. One of them was The History and Origins of Consciousness, The History and Origins of Consciousness. And the other book is Edith Harding's book, or I'm sorry, it's not Edith, it's Esther Harding, Esther Harding's book, Psychic Energy. Both of those books are excellent, and they give you a good overview of the development of the human mind and psychology generally. Now, what I'm proposing to do here is I'm going to take it pretty slow going through this book. There's a lot of things to talk about. I'm going to try to incorporate what you folks are saying about it as much as possible, with the exception of when we're live over at Sammy's Pizza Kitchen, and we'll just take it a paragraph at a time and talk about these points, because they really cover all the points of Jungian psychology over a period of time. And whether it takes a year or whatever it takes to do this, I think it's well worth the effort. And you're obviously free to go out and get a copy of Psychology and Alchemy, or find it in our Dropbox if you have access to our Dropbox. And you can find an electronic copy, although, as you see, I mark up books very heavily, and I tab them where I think there's something very important, because I want to go back and think about some specific idea, and so it's pretty hard to do that on an electronic version. So I do urge you to go actually buy the book, which is about $30, but I think if you go on Amazon Used Books, and I often buy my books from Amazon Used Books because, someone will be done with a book, they've gotten it and thought they were going to read a novel, and then they found out, oh, this is heavier than that, so they go ahead and sell it back to Amazon or one of these book dealers. And they're in good shape, good enough shape for you to then mark up and not feel guilty about it. And so, for example, one time I got 3 copies of Man and His Symbols, the hardbound version, for less than $10. And so there's a lot of these books that are available on the used book market, and I urge you to find them. Let's see. So, all right, so I want to go back now to even to paragraph 6, where Dr. Jung was talking about the fateful detours and wrong turnings. And basically, what Dr. Jung is saying, and he says that it's the longissima via, it's the long road, which is snake-like, and it's not lacking in terrors. Okay, that's because we all screw up, and we get beaten down by the slings and arrows of life, one way or another. We all have done it, and this is why the Job archetype is so important, because it's only with the Job archetype, which just because I'm mentioning it again, I'm just going to put it on the chat again. Contest, defeat, lamentation, rebirth. Okay, so we go through this cycle many times during life, and it starts from almost from birth, but even when we're at our mother's teat and we start to get little teeth and mama goes ouch, then we realize that we can't suck quite as hard or bite quite as hard then, and that may cause us to cry if we're a few month old infant, but then we find out that our mother still loves us, and then so we're reborn into our next phase, and each time we go through that cycle, our ego gets stronger, and so it's common for infants who are about 3 years old to start differentiating their ego from their self, the basic unconscious driving force, the force of Star Wars. May the force be with you. And from then on, we are separated from that driving force, and then we gradually separate more and more and more, obviously, until we reach adulthood and start having our own adult lives. And as we learn more about being a human being in our youth, and hopefully we go through that a lot of times. Now, I did sort of jab one of our women participants in the ribs in Sammy's, not literally, but I was kidding her, saying, when your kids were growing up, you weren't one of the mothers that demanded that all the kids get a trophy, were you? She had to laugh, because we went through a period in the 70s, 80s, and at least the early 90s where every little kid had to get a trophy. But the problem is that if kids aren't defeated, they don't learn, they don't develop, their ego doesn't develop. And so you shouldn't be doing that to your children. You should definitely get them out there, let them try to do something. If they succeed with it, fine, keep going as much as possible. But at some point, they're going to be defeated. For example, I have a granddaughter who's 10 years old, and she's now ranked number 28 nationwide in her age group in gymnastics. And a couple weeks ago, she got the highest score of anyone at a meet she was at, and she, I think, got 3 of the 4 routines as number 1 for herself. Now, that's wonderful, and she's 10 years old, and that's great, but very likely at some point she's going to suffer a defeat, and that's going to be crushing at some point, and she'll have to be reborn and build up her ego more each time. Am I meant to do this gymnastics or am I not? And lots of kids do fall back and don't do any more. And for example, when I was in the 8th grade, I thought I could be a quarterback on the weight football team. That was a football team of everybody under 115 pounds. And I weighed about 100 pounds at the time. We even used a smaller football at 8th grade. And, I found out I wasn't a very good quarterback. So the next time I tried as a linebacker and as a lineman. And what I found out was that on the varsity team, varsity and JV, the average weight on my high school team was 164, believe it or not. 164 was the average weight on the team. But I weighed 125 at that time in the 10th grade. And so I would just get bowled over by these bigger kids all the time. So what I came to know is that I wasn't going to be big enough to be a very successful football player. So I went into high school acting instead. So I got to kiss the girls on the high school plays instead of being out on the football field. But that suited me fine, and I was reborn into that. And later on, I was able to reprove my manhood by becoming a Marine Corps officer. But in any case, Thomas says, our culture teaches people how to win, but not how to lose. Yep, that's a problem. That's definitely a problem. And Jonathan says, I always imagine the helix shape when I think of the cycles of growth we go through, circling upwards. Each circle is similar to the shape, but at a higher level degree, our psyche grows the shape of the DNA. Well, that's sort of true, except sometimes you get knocked back and you have to keep assaulting the beach. And I think that there are plenty of young women who fall off a balance beam or some piece of apparatus and injure themselves, and then they have to decide whether they have what it takes to be a gymnast at the next level. Obviously, I would love to see my granddaughter win a scholarship to college as a gymnast, and I don't dare hope, though, because I know that the competition is vicious, and to be number 28 in age group is still quite an accomplishment. But anyway, her parents very wisely have decided they might not even tell her about that because they don't want her to go to her head. Thomas says the double helix is reminiscent of the hermetic caduceus Jung mentions, yes. And then winners are glorified, showered with honorifics and news media attention. No stories about those who lose, no attention from the collective. And, that's a problem. And we're going to see what a problem it is when you are able to get through by bluster, let's say, because our president has managed to bluff his way to the top of American society right now, but much of his success seems hollow. And when it starts to fall apart, and it seems evident that it will start to fall apart in one way or another, it's going to be interesting to see if he can support that. And it relates to the Midas complex, King Midas. Let me just show you why this is important. Oh, there it is. Okay. All right. So many of you will remember this picture that I took in the marina that's associated with my condominium complex. And this particular boat is a 63-foot motor yacht. It's quite lovely. And it has a very appropriate name on it, Never Enough, because chasing material things, you never have enough. And, our president is a perfect example of that, where he has chased material things and he never has enough. But, very honestly, do you think he has a happy life today? Or, his wife, the First Lady, does she have a happy life? Does his son have a happy life? I don't know. I mean, the owner of this boat, I don't know who the owner is, but he's not on this boat. And this boat is sitting here idly, which is his investment, not being used. And so that's the god of materialism that we all have to fight off, because we have to understand that it doesn't make us happy. It won't make us happy. And so, I've had all kinds of automobiles in my time, but, the happiest I ever was with a 1953 Volkswagen when I was a senior in college, which was the very old Volkswagen Bug that had two back windows, two little teeny back windows. And, almost definitely you have never seen such a VW, but I had one. And I drove it for a year, and it was very good. But outside of my community here in the parking lots, you can find lots of fancy cars of every stripe, from Bentleys and Mercedes right on down. And but are their owners happy? Happier? I don't know. I'm doubtful. So you have to decide what's important in life and see what's important in life. And in the end, you might have a big tower in central New York, but are you going to live in it? Are you going to be happy living there? I don't know. Or even if you're living on a golf course in Florida, who knows? Thomas says, think of how a president like Lincoln or Kennedy suffered defeats and how they came out of them. Not sure the present leader could sustain himself in defeat and survive psychically. And, I guess the question is he actually surviving psychically? I mean, there have been intimations that he may be using certain pharmaceuticals to hold himself together. And, it's very clear that the White House staff is trying to keep him on the road and in big rallies where he can feel like he's the big important man, because they know that a narcissist that's that blatantly narcissistic will collapse if he doesn't have adulation. And he can't look at the reality of how people really feel about him around the country. And, there's a reason that the TV is not allowed to show the actual crowds in his audience, because, when you see those crowds, it's quite amazing. I'm not going to go into it further than that. And Sean says, thank you for showing me Art Neumann. Yeah, Neumann is very good. He did a book about the child and another one about the great mother, and he's really an excellent writer. And when World War II was over, he came to Switzerland and wanted Jung to help him get his book published as the first publication of the C.G. Jung Institute. And while Jung knew that it was a very powerful book, he couldn't allow that because everyone was afraid of him. Okay, everybody was afraid that this 800-page book that he had written would just overwhelm everybody else that was one of Jung's followers. And so Jung had to, he did help him get it published, but it wasn't an official publication of the C.G. Jung Institute until afterward. And Jonathan says, inner wealth is priceless. Absolutely, it's priceless. You have to get a life, and you have to build up that bank account in your psyche, not with anything else. And Sean says, I was thinking about another cycle that is different from the rebirth cycle, but the refinement cycle. It takes some people a lot of time to figure that out. The cycle where the rules that worked for you previously have to be broken to move on to the new pattern. That's definitely true too. I mean, this is my fundamental disagreement with Jordan Peterson's approach, because you know, a teacher can teach you all the rules. You can learn every formula that's ever been written in physics, and it doesn't help you get a life, okay? And when you get out into an academic career, you find out that it's all politics, and you don't know anything about politics, and you better learn, because some other people are going to be competing with you. And the stories of the 20th century in science is filled with scientists who were fighting with one another, left, right, and center, and that's all politics. And there are no rules that you can really point to. I mean, there are people's experiences, but man, you better have a tough skin. And even Anne Belford Ulanoff, who I've spoken about before, she complains about it in the Jungian circles, and for my part, I have moved away from the Jungian analyst realm, because I don't think it's useful for what I'm trying to do. I mean, I'm trying to understand the meaning of these things from a societal point of view. And this book that I'm currently reading, where is it? Well, I must have left it out on my other table, but in any case, as you probably know, I'm currently reading The Mystery of the Conjunctio, about what wholeness is and achieving wholeness from a alchemical point of view is. And this is a book that was written by Edward Edinger, and here it is. Okay, so I started to read this book, The Mystery of the Conjunctio, Alchemical Images of Individuation. And so I've sort of lost my train of thought. But in any case, Oh, I know what I wanted to say. Edinger in that book is talking about the conjunctio and individuation from 3 points of view: from the point of view of the individual, from the point of view of a couple, like a married couple, and from the point of view of society at large. And my interest relates to society at large. That's where my main interest is. And, so Dr. Jung was very adamant that you have to work with one person at a time. And, that's all well and good, except that it's very slow. And I'm not sure that society can wait long enough for enough thousands or tens of thousands of us to get fully comfortable with how our psyche works before, and most of us will never go to analysis, so we'll never be exposed to this material anyway in a thorough way. And so my concern is, how can we use this material in society, as Edinger says we can, and that isn't going to come from Jungian analysts. Jungian analysts have a profession that they rightfully have to protect, and so when they're presenting Jung at these various Jungian societies around the country, they are basically using them as intakes for analysts, for the local analysts. So they'll do a weekend workshop on Persephone and Demeter, for example, and everybody comes and they say, oh, golly gee, isn't that cool to understand that archetype? And a few of those people will meet a Jungian analyst at that event, and they'll go off and start analyzing. And, there's nothing wrong with that. That's a profession, and it's quite needed. But those people are not bringing the same ideas into politics. And so that's what I'm doing. I'm breaking the rules, as Sean rightly points out. I'm breaking the rules because I'm not a C.G. Jung Institute trained individual, but I know that I'm fairly competent. I've actually, believe it or not, I've actually tried to get a Jungian analyst to work with me on the theory, as Dr. Jung felt that if you were going to be an analyst, you should be analyzed yourself on a regular basis. And so Jung's analyst was Tony Wolff, and she worked with him for 45 years. And we won't say what else might have gone on Wednesday afternoons at her place when his red Mercedes was pulled in the driveway. But what we do know for sure is that she analyzed him, and they worked as collaborators on this material for, most of Tony's adult life. And so I thought, in fairness, let me go get an analyst too. So I tried to recruit one or two, and one of them actually said she was afraid of taking me on. And I actually went to talk to her about it, and she admitted to me that she hadn't read the Red Book. And I said, you hadn't read the Red Book? Goodness gracious. And so anyway, I had to become self-taught, and I guess all of you do too, unless you really need an analyst, in which case I would urge you to go see one. But that's not my purpose. So so when Sean says you have to break the rules, that's what I'm doing, and I'm doing it consciously and intentionally, because I think Dr. Jung's work needs to be more broadly known, and people need to understand themselves better. Excuse me. Okay, Brian says, fascinating on the alchemical dictionary, particularly Solvay and Coagula. It was quite a research and scholarly achievement to pore over and curate that information, for sure. I mean, he really grokked it. He probably grokked it better than alchemists themselves did at the time, because keep in mind, when alchemy was a thing, and going back to the 15th century, the average man in the 15th century was only presented in a lifetime as much information as we are now presented with in one edition of the Sunday New York Times. So times were very different back then. And he says, the cost of sanity in this society is a certain level of alienation. As Terence McKenna says, yes, yeah, we have to be able to handle that. And this is one of the issues of individuation, which is being able to hold the opposites in consciousness. Sean says, yeah, I realized that epiphany before, and seeing your gift and finding a way to give back to the world. One thing I would add to all of our subscribers is that, if you feel motivated to create a YouTube channel, you are absolutely free to take any of the material I've put on video and put it on your own channel. The only thing I ask is that you don't change the meaning of my words, but other than that, you're free to take anything you find on my channel or on the Archetype in Action website and spread it around, because that's what we need to do. And also you can help this project by doing two things. One is by sharing on your social networks, and also by subscribing. And ironically, the statistics I get from YouTube say that it's still true that only 48% of the people that are viewing my videos in the last 28 days are subscribers. 52% are just coming in randomly. So I'd love to see that number change, and so that more subscribers than not would be seeing these videos. Although the channel has been doing quite well, and has been growing on a steady basis, especially in the last couple of months. So I'm appreciative for that. And one other thing is, when you see me tweet or you tweet, but if you see a tweet from me, a retweet would be appreciated, because a like doesn't do anything, but a retweet is spreading out among your followers that would help get it out. It doesn't necessarily mean you endorse it, but that would help the process here. Because if we all understand ourselves and how our minds work, then we're going to be able to be better citizens in society. And Grenade says, let's see. Grenade says, what is the psychology behind the midlife crisis. I think the psychology behind the midlife crisis, and I've been through that period, fortunately, is that when you're under 35, you're still learning where the bathrooms are. Okay, you're learning how to become a human being. You're learning how to handle a profession. Very often you're learning how to be a parent, and you're following what Edinger calls nature. Edinger says that Mother Nature is imperious. What he means by that is that we all have sexuality, and Mother Nature is going to make us reproduce. And so we all go through those things, and we think we have a goal that we're going to do something, and then you get to a point somewhere between 35 and 45 years old where you realize that you're not going to realize your goal. Okay, you're never going to be as famous as Stephen Hawking, or you realize you're never going to be president of the United States, or you're not going to be a general in the Marine Corps, those sorts of things. And that sets you into a major round, a major cycle in the Job archetype. And hopefully by the time that comes, you've been through the cycle enough times so that you have a strong enough ego to handle it. And, I certainly hope that's true of all of you. But suddenly you get to a point where you've really been working toward a goal, and you've been having a modicum of success. In my case, I went to college and law school and business school, and I started to progress in the Marines. And so when I was 32 years old, I had 10 years of higher education under my belt. And I really liked it. I really liked going to school. I enjoyed it very much. And I would have gladly gone back. But the problem is, when you're going to school, you're still learning how to be a human being, and you're learning how to be a certain profession, whatever it is. And so you find out that you can't just keep going to school. You have to go out and get a life, and you have to get experience. And so at that point, you have to do a reevaluation, and it's a major reevaluation. So you go through this Job cycle where you're defeated. You realize that your goal is unattainable. As the Kingston Trio had in a song back in the 50s, the stars we could reach were just starfish on the beach. And so, not everybody can be an astronaut in that way. I mean, it was a song about the astronauts, of course, but we can't all be astronauts. Not all of us are going to go to Mars. Not all of our progeny are going to get off the Earth permanently before the Earth is sucked up by the dying sun. Of course, that won't happen for a couple of billion years, but you realize that you're not going to make that goal, whether it's to, in my granddaughter's case, go to the Olympics, let's say, which I doubt if she's even thinking about yet, but it could be, and in the future. And, for every one of the 6 young women who get to go and represent the United States at the Olympics, there's at least 10,000 who have failed and who weren't quite good enough. And all of those young women have to get a life too, and so they have to go through the Job archetype very young, and hopefully their parents are good at helping them deal with with disappointment. And right now it just happens that my granddaughter has the right physique and everything, and amount of strength and so on, so that she can do quite well. But that might not be the case in another year. You don't know how your body's going to develop. And so, in my case with football, for example, I was at my tallest, I was 5'10.5". I'm now 5'8.5". Go figure. But that happens to us in life. We lose cartilage in our spines, and we get shorter. But I was only 5'10.5", and in my football age years, I was never heavier than 175 pounds. And so ultimately your body fails you because you can't play in this sport because you're not big enough. So that happens. And so let's see. I hope that answers your question, Grenada. Okay, so Thomas says, my therapist loaned me a red book for a long while. Was surprised that I knew so much about Jung. It made our conversation click much better. That's good. Sean says, this is a subtlety that only music can describe in a single moment. That is what makes music so difficult. It is being able to connect the idiom that you talk about a lot. Yeah. Okay. So it's archetypal. Dr. Jung was very moved. There's a very good story about Dr. Jung when a woman who was using music therapy in San Francisco, and she was a PhD, and she wanted to visit Jung one day, and Jung invited her, but she was a concert level pianist. And so when she arrived, Jung insisted that she sit down at the piano, and spent a couple of hours having her teach him what she would do for therapy, music therapy. And Sean, I can send you that story if you don't have it. I don't have it right handy here, but it's readily available. And Dr. Jung was extremely moved, and afterward, Dr. Jung's daughter thanked the woman and said that, she had done something that she had never been able to accomplish herself with her father, which was to express the archetypal nature of music. And I don't know if you've seen, I recently saw on YouTube this video of Japanese, and only in Japan would you see this probably, but a choir of 10,000 Japanese singing the chorus to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. It's just incredible. And so that picture is worth way more than 1,000 words. And because I'm a old Eidoko, that means a child of old Tokyo, I would have many more than 1,000 words, 100,000 words for that scene. One note is 1,000 feelings. Yes, absolutely. And when I think about it, I had a German major who was one of my roommates in my sophomore year of college, and he couldn't express to me what it meant. I mean, I had all of Beethoven's symphonies when I was in college, and I used to play it, and I would ask him, what does this mean? And he couldn't tell me. And so, but he wasn't a musician. And Andy says, few are the true Jungians, unfortunately, probably true. Thomas says, Dr. Thomas More has a good book on late life crisis. It's called Ageless Soul, and involves a lot of stuff about aging applicable. It sort of jumped on me. Applicable to anyone over 40 or 50, highly recommended. Granat says he wonders if he could avoid that. If you're thinking of avoiding the midlife crisis, it's chances of that are very slim. And Thomas says midlife crisis thing can be the point at which one starts to question society and one's role in it. Why am I doing this? Why am I married to this person, etc.? It's a defeat. And the crisis can be delayed. It can be medicated away. One can pretend it hasn't happened or it isn't happening, but eventually you have to deal with it. And that's very true. And Andy says, drink tequila on a regular basis, in moderation, okay. Sean says, my piano teacher is really old, and I told her that you can make your best song tomorrow. I believe in people, and I know for a fact that adventurous spirit will exist as long as we're alive. I keep wanting to write a symphony. But unfortunately, my father made me give up the cello in the 7th grade, so that was another of my many defeats. I love classical music, and I love playing the cello, but my parents couldn't afford the lessons, so there we go. Thomas says, that falls under the Medicaid label, Andy, but some use Xanax. Andy, Xanax isn't good for anyone. You can't learn from mistakes if you can't remember them. The Grenade says, yeah, that is why traumas stick out the most. And he's learning. And Thomas says, the picture of 100 kazoos playing Ode to Joy is my favorite musical imagining, from Thomas Pynchon's book, Gravity's Rainbow. That would be a good one. It says, like touching a hot stove and getting burnt. Thomas, non sequitur, I've given up alcohol for about 9 months, and I'm really finding some benefits from not drinking. One of the benefits I found is that I tend to lose weight when I'm not drinking. Okay, so going back to psychology and alchemy, I think I've caught up with the comments. Dr. Jung was talking about it's a mistake to blame religion for something that is due mainly to human incompetence. And he says, I'm speaking therefore not of the deepest and best understanding of Christianity, but of the superficialities and disastrous misunderstandings that are plain for all to see. The demand made by the imitatio Christi. And so one of the points he's making here and in other places is that there's nothing wrong with Christianity or any other religion per se. In fact, they're all true as psychic facts. But the problem is the way they're taught and the way they're conveyed to the congregation takes them away from what they should be doing. And so the pastors keep telling us that God's up here and God is outside us and only Christ can save us. And, this was something that Dr. Jung was very upset about, and imitatio Christi what is meant by imitatio Christi is that you have to live yourself fully. That's what your wholeness demands. And it doesn't mean that you're going to be a holy Zadok or rabbi running around in the Middle East telling stories about God the Father. It doesn't mean that at all. You're not going to imitate Christ in that way, or you're not going to imitate any of the others that way. But to live out what yourself is telling you completely, and that's what Christ did, and that was the magic that he did. He lived the spiritual life perfectly, except for this one thing which proved that he was a human. He was both the Son of God and human when he said on the cross, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" And so that was the human element of Christ and why he was the God-man. But remember, Christ said that he had to leave so that the Paraclete could come, the Holy Ghost. And the point was that as long as he was there, then everybody would be projecting out and depending upon him for everything. And his point was that if the Holy Ghost then came in, then all of us could learn to live the style of life, or live, let's say, a good life, not an evil life, as he did, and we could all do it in our own way, and that would be just as perfect. And so in that sense, we are all sons and daughters of God. And so this is the point of the Holy Ghost. And Dr. Jung, one time he was in New York in 1937, and he was seated next to a Catholic bishop, and he commented on the fact that the Catholic Church didn't do much about the Holy Ghost, and the bishop admitted that they hadn't done much about the Holy Ghost. So, the point is, okay, these religions interjected themselves between average human beings and God. And so they wanted to be the interpreters of God, and they made a living out of it. And they found that it was a good living. And so when people started to say, "Oh no, he's not right," they'd burn him at the stake. And the trouble with that approach is that some people didn't cotton to that very much, Martin Luther being one, and so Protestants moved away from the church, and others became very hypocritical and thought that they could just pay money and get off the hook for their bad deeds. Then Dr. Jung went on, now in paragraph 8, and is talking about Western man is held in thrall by the 10,000 things. Okay, so that's this situation. We're held in the thrall of these things because we think if we have a big boat or a fancy car, that is going to bring us happiness in life. And the problem is it won't. And so this is what he means by in the thrall of the 10,000 things. So if the owner of this boat, who believes he never has enough, next year goes and buys an even bigger boat, I suppose he'll call that never enough too. And And the reason it's never enough is that it never achieves the happiness that he expects, and so therefore he's not out on it. It's tied up at the dock. So he says, Western man is held in thrall by the 10,000 things, materialism, right? He sees only particulars. He is ego-bound and thing-bound and unaware of the deep root of all being. Eastern man, on the other hand, experiences the world of particulars and even his own ego like a dream. Okay, so that would be my criticism of, let's say, Buddhism, because I feel that Buddhism promotes passivity. And even though I do go to a Buddhist meditation group, I mainly go there to open up my unconscious through meditation so that I have a better flow of my unconscious. But it isn't because I want to be as passive as the average Tibetan Buddhist is, because, it's wonderful in one way, and that is that a lot of people can live on $1 or $2 a day, and they don't mind. And that works in Hinduism as well. But by the same token, human beings have some big tasks ahead of us, and not the least of which is to create an environment that will allow peace around the world. That's not so easy. If we increase our level of consciousness, maybe it is, but we have to be able to see what we don't see. And so, for example, what's better, a wall on the southern border of the United States for $5 billion, or $5 billion channeled to people in Guatemala, Costa Rica, and Ecuador, or other Middle American countries, so that people are happy and want to stay where their families always have been. People only move when they have to. And so if they don't have to, then we won't have so many people seeking asylum in the United States. And so what is the right approach? Well, George Batten says fixed fortifications are monuments to the stupidity of man. I'll just leave it at that. And Andy says, are we doomed to attempt an articulation of a fact we cannot possibly articulate? And that is the issue, Andy, because ultimately all of these things have to be learned by experience, not by rules. And so, rules won't save you from chaos. They might save you from chaos as long as you're in college and daddy is paying the tuition fee. Then they save you from chaos. But once you graduate from college and have to start having a life of your own, then you have to get experience. And then the articulation of the experience and what that means is very difficult. For example, there's a saying in the Marines, once a Marine, always a Marine. And that's absolutely true. And if you're not a Marine, I couldn't possibly tell you what it's like to be a Marine. Okay, not at all. I couldn't possibly tell you. And that is an experience that only Marines know. And And it's different from the experience of a soldier or a Navy person or whatever. They have different experiences. And they couldn't tell me what their experience is like. I mean, what's it like to go on a patrol in a nuclear submarine for 90 days or 70 days? And you never breathe outside air. I mean, what's that like? That's not something that you can really express. So yes, we're doomed in that way. And so Sean, point converging toward infinity, I'm not quite sure what that refers to. I believe in something similar where we have to be prepared for the given moment opportunity to perform your calling or miracle as the greatest. Well, that certainly can be, and I would certainly urge you to write that one song or whatever piece that you might do, or do the one thing in music that you might do. Andy says, rules won't save you from chaos is an epic quote, Skip. Well, thank you. If you think they will, then have a couple little children and try to sleep in on Saturday morning. It doesn't matter what you tell them. Okay, moving on. All right, so the next point is that the translators of the Bible, some versions of the Bible talk about Christ within you, but most of them talk about Christ among you. They mostly talk about Christ as being this being out there that's going to somehow save you. Save you from what? Is it going to save you from death? No. Okay, we're all going to die. And, you know, once you conceive a child, you owe a death. Okay, very simple. And so you have to have that Christ within you, the true meaning of those religious ideas. And so the reason those religious ideas worked for all these years and are still working is because they are a kind of a grand scheme of psychotherapy. Their shortcoming is when you try to say that they're literally true in the physical world. Okay, so the Bible is 100% true as a psychic fact, but it is not 100% true as physical facts, which is why the scientific method has punched holes into organized religion for the last 500 years, and why it caused us to lose our containment in religion at the end of the 19th century and caused 175 million deaths in the 20th century. And so we have to find a new way to build the containment so that human beings will focus on the things that we should be focusing on, rather than trying to kill one another. I mean, that worked for a period of time, but it's not going to work anymore. And I do have a image on that. Okay, I have a couple of images on that. Which are these. That's why, okay? We have to learn how to live together because we're all in this planet together. and there are a lot more of us now than there were at the time of Christ. And so we better start focusing on how we're going to do that, because that thin blue line right there is all the air we have to breathe forever. And in this image, you are there. That's the small blue dot as seen from the other side of Saturn. And so everything that you ever learned, everything that ever happened to any living being that we know of, happened on that little dot. And so that's the issue. And if you have a little humility about it, then you know what we have to work on. Let's see. Okay. So the issue is, you can cast your sins upon Christ, but you evade your deepest responsibility. This is paragraph 9. And so that is really contrary to the spirit of Christianity. And Dr. Jung's point is that if the supreme value is Christ or God, and the supreme negation is sin, and if they're outside of you, then the soul is void, and its highest and lowest parts are missing. And by contrast, in the Indian tradition, the highest and lowest are transcendental self, Atman, and but in the West we have a uniform depreciation of the soul. And so what we have to understand is that religious experiences are not only psychological. They are metaphysical. They are experiences, not describable. And the problem is that theologians tend to overlook the psychic origin of religious phenomena. And they tend to call everybody else's religion only psychological, but it is, it's really all there is in all religions. And so if we understand that, then we can understand and see the value of whatever our faith approach is. They all have value, and they all have ritual and so on, and we can learn from one another, and we can make things work. I mean, I have been exposed, fortunately, to many different religions. Starting when I was 15, I started to be exposed to both Shinto and Buddhism in Japan, and then later in Hinduism and Buddhism in India, and more recently, since 2002, to Islam. And all of them have something that can help us in one way or another. And so rather than say that they're all wrong, let's say that they're all right, okay, that they're all psychic facts, they all developed organically, and, what can be wrong with praying 5 times a day, for example, okay? Now, the way I perceive a prayer is a petition to your unconscious, okay? It's not a prayer to the puppet master up there in the sky, and it's not Christ going to pull you across the goal line or get you an A on your test. It's your unconscious, the force with you, that is going to get you through. I mean, the force that gets a football player to kick the key field goal last night in the football game between the Patriots and the Chiefs, that didn't come from outside. That came from the self of the players that made that field goal possible and that final touchdown possible. And that involved hours and hours of exercise and hours of study and training. And so the prayer that the football player has to do is, please let all of my effort that came to this game to be fully realized in this game. Okay, but it's a petition to yourself to make that happen. So the force is with you, and that's what we're talking about. And but the problem is that theologians tend to say, well, other religions are only psychic. They're only psyche, and the problem is everything is psyche. Okay. Everything that you can see is psyche. So psyche is a totality of psychic processes. And the soul image in psychology is the anima and animus, and it's more primitive. And I did put this, made this available. Okay, so this is a diagram of the psyche that Dr. Edward Edinger created. And here you see that the self is the deepest archetype in the unconscious. And the self tends to see the world through the lens of either anima or animus, depending on whether we're a man or a woman. So for men, that's typically an anima, and so you see the line coming up out of the self toward the man's ego, and it comes through the lens of the anima, if you will. And for a woman, it comes through the lens of the animus. And so then you, from your ego, then projects down the shadow. But the self is the controlling archetype in the deepest unconscious. And, Dr. Jung's position, which you can see on the front page of this channel, is that the unconscious does equal God. Okay, and that salvation is individuation, is seeing the beauty of your human life and how to make it effective, and that's what happens through individuation. And let's see. Andy says, belief is often just as good to the individual as truth. And Dr. Jung would say absolutely that if someone has, he called it the charisma of belief, but I think what he meant is something like if he's blessed by belief, then he should be left to that, because that's a pretty blissful place to be. But if your belief has been poisoned by the scientific method, as religions have been poisoned over the last 500 years by the scientific method, then you need a different way to think about it. And this is what Dr. Jung was addressing, which is that the new dispensation is not belief but knowledge, and that knowledge can be achieved through psychology. Sean says, I was thinking about how brilliant Ulanov is, and she is sort of the four-star generals with her interpretations because she had the order and creativity to break the necessary rules. Absolutely. The leading generals do that too. And he says, we can't look down on a happy Roman Catholic. Their individual truths are good enough for them. Yeah, I hope so. I hope so. I don't know of. I know of lots of people who are lapsed Catholics, but anyway, reminds me of a quote. Sean says, reminds me of a quote from Carl Jung. Am I the one who is sitting on the stone, or am I the stone on which he is sitting? And that's sort of the issue here. There's personality number one and personality number two that is discussed in Memory Stream's reflections. And personality number two is the self, as you see in this diagram. And Sean says it refers, oh, wait a minute. Andy says, every once in a while, voodoo priestess can read your future from chicken entrails. Well, so can a tarot reader or an astrologer or many others. That is divination, and it works. Sean says it refers to the thinker statue. I don't know. We'd have to talk about the thinker statue. I think Auguste Rodin had something in mind, something like that the thinker was, a primitive man who was just breaking through to have consciousness at all, as opposed to just being in participation mystique, as Lévi-Brühl had it, and as Jung often refers to it, which is what other animals have. And so they don't really have consciousness. They go with the flow, and so monkey see, monkey do type of thing. But the thinker was the first man who was trying to pull a concept together, let's say. I think that's, as I used to, or I read quite a bit about Auguste Rodin, and I think that's basically what he had to say about it. And it is all, and Andy says it's all symbolism and belief embodied in the pleroma. Yep. Sean, do you think the ethos is the opposite of the logos? I think the eros is the opposite of the logos. And actually, except eros is sort of an unfortunate way of putting it. I actually don't know what ethos means per se, but I would say logos is an opposite to life. Okay, and so it's not chaos, it's life. And so when Jordan Peterson writes a book, 12 Rules of Life, an Antidote to Chaos, maybe it should have been 12 Rules of Life and Antidote to Life. And because you can't live by rules. That doesn't work. I mean, you can, it's aspirational, let's say, but you can't always live by rules. And if you have any doubt about that, if you're wife comes home with a new hairdo, don't forget to tell her how wonderful it is. Because if you don't, anyway. So Chris says the eros is the opposite of logos. No, yes. I think there's, depending on what we're talking about, there are probably many counterparts to logos or the word. Sean says, that's the general consensus, I believe, but I was wondering a different perspective. Right. And First Earl Hardwick says, could there be problems with seeing your unconscious as God? Can an excess be pride, be a bad thing, seeing it as such? And Gurdad says, if you can observe your own psyche, who is the one observing it? Well, that's a good question, but let me go back to the First Earl of Hardwick, because I do have an answer to that, and that is that Dr. Jung was concerned that if people started to see themselves as divine, there could be inflation. And keep in mind that we have to stay in this lane between inflation on one side and alienation on the other. That's where we're going to find happiness. And so what happens if you see yourself as God, it does create an unavoidable inflation. And so the very last paragraph of Answer to Job, okay, which is probably Dr. Jung's most important work. Let me just read a part of it here. Well, then there arises that reciprocal action between two relatively autonomous factors, which compels us, when describing and explaining the processes, we're talking about psychological processes now, to present sometimes the one and sometimes the other factor as the acting subject, even when God becomes man. The Christian solution has hitherto avoided this difficulty by recognizing Christ as the one and only God-man. But the indwelling of the Holy Ghost, the third divine person, in man brings about a Christification of many, and the question then arises whether these many are all complete God-men. Such a transformation would lead to insufferable collisions between them, to say nothing of the unavoidable inflation to which the ordinary mortal is not freed from original sin, who is not freed from original sin, would instantly succumb. In these circumstances, it is well to remind ourselves of St. Paul and his split consciousness. On one side, he felt he was the apostle directly called and enlightened by God, and on the other side, a sinful man who could not pluck out the thorn in the flesh and rid himself of the satanic angel who plagued him. That is to say, even the enlightened person remains what he is, and is never more than his own limited ego before the One who dwells within him, whose form has no knowable boundaries, who encompasses him on all sides, fathomless as the abysms of the earth and vast as the sky. Okay, so it is a issue. Inflation is an issue, but nonetheless, if not us, who, and if not now, when, as I think an old Jewish saying has it. And so, who is the one observing it? If you observe your own psyche, who is the one observing it? if you're talking about the total psyche, I get the observer, the conscious, everything that's conscious is in the ego. So I guess we'd have to say the ego. Thomas says, when the idea of the unconscious was first brought out, it offended many people. What? There's something in me of which I am unconscious? And Mallory Reed says, I really appreciate your chats. You help me remember to stick with Jung. And Andy says, hope you're doing better, Mallory. Yes, me too. I'm glad to see you here, very much so. Okay, so let's see, what else? So one of the things Dr. Jung is saying in this paragraph 9 is that in Christianity, transcendental energy is in man, and the spiritual part of man is considered in its moral aspect or in relation to God. Okay, so paragraph 10, we should speak of the soul with reverence, but Western man thinks there is nothing of value in it, nothing material. And with people who put nothing into their souls and have all God outside. And that's like the people who have that lovely boat. Here the soul is a psychic phenomenological fact of highly numinous character throughout this book. And so then I'm planning to go very heavily into paragraphs 11 and 12, and I will begin that next week. But I just want to show you my copy. Okay, so here's paragraphs 11 and 12 in my copy, where I've underlined almost every sentence. And so there are some incredibly important ideas in here, and I will leave them for discussion for next week. And as I said, we're going to work through this as sort of a history of the psyche and continue on with the chats as we've been doing. I hope that's helpful to you. I presume you wouldn't be here if it wasn't helpful to you. In the advanced reading group, I will be starting a seminar on Mysterium Conjunctionis beginning probably early in February. It won't be the first Monday in February because that will be one of our local meets at Sammy's Pizza Kitchen. And so it will probably be the second week of February, but actually we don't do our advanced group on Monday nights, so as you were on that one. But anyway, sometime in early February, probably the 6th of February, then we're going to begin, and I anticipate Mysterium, which I am conducting more as a graduate level seminar, although there's no mandatory assignments and no tests, but we do have a discussion on Zoom in the advanced group. And so I anticipate that seminar to take about a year to get through. We're just about to finish our work with Ion, and as of now, I think there are 31 sessions in the advanced reading group Dropbox. So if you join the advanced group now, you can catch up by watching let's see, about 60 hours of video of our seminar on Ion. Hi, D. Lara. Nice to see you. I'm glad to see you here. won't say anything more about it, but it's nice to see you here. And so anyway, I urge you to support the channel by subscribing and by supporting it, sharing it on social networking, and hopefully we can get that statistic up over 50% in terms of the number of people that look at the videos. Up till now, we haven't cracked the 50% level in terms of subscribers. And Andy says, and most people, the ego runs the show. That's right. And so, but the midlife crisis comes when you find out the ego doesn't run the show. Then you have to gain a little humility, and that's when the midlife crisis comes. Thomas says, Alan Watts used to say people think there's this entity behind their eyes called I or me, when it's actually not the case. It's an illusion caused by brain-centric ideas, right? And Sean says, thanks as always, Skip, everyone, for great chats. You guys are the best. Namaste to all, says Dennis, or Thomas. And Lara says, I was here last week, just not logged in. Oh, okay. Anyway, nice to have you here. I'm glad you're here. And Mallory says, would it be okay to request a book recommendation on essential Jung? I haven't studied in earnest in about 30 years. Okay, well, first of all, Mallory, many of these books are available in an electronic version on our Dropbox. So if you're already a member of our Dropbox, you can find them there under Collected Works. And so anything that I mentioned now, you can find there. And you're free to download anything that you find there, although you're going to be much better off if you get a hard copy sooner rather than later. And by the way, there's a very interesting book now that I did add to the Dropbox this last week, which is called Catafalque by Peter Kingsley. And it turns out to be a different kind of autobiography of or not autobiography, but biography of Dr. Jung. It's available, it's newly published on Amazon. If you purchase it in hardbound on Amazon, it will cost you about $75. It's in 2 volumes. The second volume is entirely the footnotes from the first volume, if you can imagine that. So it's called Catafalque. I'll put that name here, but you can find an electronic version of it on the Dropbox. And so if you're not a member, let me put his name on, by Peter Kingsley. Okay, so if you're not a member of our Dropbox, send an email to skip.conover@gmail.com. I need your normal email address, not from Facebook or something like that, for Dropbox. That's their requirement. It's not mine, but anyway. So if you send me your email address, I will add you to our Dropbox, and then you can find these things. So the recommendable books would be to start with Man and His Symbols. That was the book that Dr. Jung recommended or had a dream about and decided to write for laymen at the end of his life. And he wrote the first essay in it, and then there were essays also written in there by others, including Marie-Louise von France and others. And Yella Yaffe has a essay in there, and those are aimed at the individual layman. The other book to read, and you can get this from audible.com, where they have a terrific reading of this book, is Memories, Dreams, Reflections. That will give you an overview of Jungian psychology. I also recommend that you see two movies. One is A Dangerous Method, which has the story of Jung, Freud, and Sabine Spielrein. And Sabine Spielrein is played by Keira Knightley, and I think she should have gotten an Academy Award for that performance, but unfortunately it's a little bit risque, so I think the Academy of Motion Picture Arts was afraid of doing that, but I highly recommend that movie. And also there's another movie which is called The Soul Keeper, and you can get that movie in, I think, about 6 segments. There may be a full one now on YouTube, but anyway, if you can't get the full one, the last time I looked, there were 6 15-minute parts of that movie, which is called The Soul Keeper, and that's also about the same point in history. Let's see. Thank you, Dennis, or Thomas. Grenard said, makes sense. The brain stimulates images of reality through neurochemical interaction and ties it together by telling stories to itself. The ego is the part of that hallucination that separates self from other. Right. And one other thing, Mallory, is that I go to the playlist on this channel called JRG1 for Jung Reading Group 1. That covers the first year of this reading group, in which I did discuss Man and His Symbols in detail, and where there's a lot of basic Jungian ideas discussed in those videos, so that's an easier way to do it sometimes. Bernard says the brain simulates images of reality through neurochemical interaction and ties it together by telling stories to itself. The ego is the part of that hallucination that separates self from others. Right. But I wouldn't say the brain simulates images. We actually think in images. That's the way our psyche works. At least that's Dr. Jung's position, and I'm not changing his position. So I wouldn't say it simulates images. Our psyche actually thinks in images. And Thomas says, right, Memories, Dreams, Reflections has a personal touch of a sort of psychological memoir. It's actually the memory or the memoir of Dr. Jung's own psychological development from earliest times in his childhood through the end of his life. And interestingly, apparently a lot of the material that Agnella Jaffe developed for that book was censored by Dr. Jung's family at the time. Now, we're talking about nearly 60 years ago, and that has now been cleared, and so that material is called the Protocols, and the Philemon Foundation has a contract now to produce those protocols, which should be quite interesting because they're apparently they're the parts of the book the family didn't want to come out. And Art says, here's my email address in the Dropbox. Okay, is that all one word, Art? I'll try to take it off of here now and put it on a text file here so I have it. But I mean, are there actually there can't be spaces in it, so I will try that. And Thomas says, my name was Sabina Spielrein is a very good movie too. Less racy, closer to the truth, maybe so. And Mallory says, many thanks, excellent. I was too young to appreciate the book in my 20s. Yes, so were we all. Quite true. And as Jordan Peterson correctly says, most people simply bounce off Jung, and you know, it's not easy material. As I indicate, these two paragraphs, 11 and 12, which I showed you a little while ago, where I underlined every sentence practically, just gives you a sense of how complex it is. We'll see if we can get through just those two sentences next week. But anyway, it's so my plan is to continue on through psychology and alchemy. There are 43 paragraphs on this topic of what is it called? Oh, Introduction to the Religious and Psychological Problems in Alchemy. So that's Dr. Jung's initial introduction. That's 43 paragraphs. Then the next major part of the book is the Wolfgang Pauli dreams, and his individuation process is discussed in detail there, and that will be quite interesting. In total, this book, I'm just going to give you an order of magnitude here. In 2 weeks, I guess, we've gotten up to paragraph 11, and there are 554 paragraphs in the book. So it's non-trivial, and you get a sense of how it is that many people bounce off this work because you don't read it like a novel. Not at all. Granat says, if only Jung was still alive, wonder how his theories would have evolved. Well, they are evolving with us, and he is still alive, and he's alive within us because we have the interest for it. And I'm convinced that this is how all great artists have been remembered over time. You know, whether it's Beethoven or Solzhenitsyn or any other great artist. And so what we're doing here is trying to unpack this a little so that others can find ways to work with it further, and that's every bit like what Dr. Jung would have wanted. So anyway, thank you all for joining. Art says, yes, one word. Not quite sure what you mean by that, Art, but oh, okay, you're talking about the email address. Okay, I'll add you to the Dropbox in the next few minutes. You should have it, and you should have an email from me. If you don't get that before tomorrow morning, please send me an email to skip.conover@gmail.com. And so I'm going to sign off now because we're over the 2 hours. And I probably, the other thing to talk about here, just briefly, is, here we are. Okay, so this book, I did put the 7 Sermons to the Dead from the Red Book on the channel last week. And if you haven't listened to the 7 Sermons of the Dead, I urge you to do so. The other book is this, The Mystery of the Conjunctio. And this is sort of a quick and dirty cheat sheet for Mysterium, which I am going to do on the public channel. So just to give you an order of magnitude, this is the Conjunctio. This is Edward Edinger's discussion of Mysterium, and then Mysterium itself is actually a bit thicker than this book. And so anyway, it's this book, the cheat sheet, or the abbreviated form, which is the discussion of the 10 images in an alchemical text called the Rosarium Philosophorum. And I've put the first reading of the very beginning of this book on the channel already. I will be doing the rest of it in the next few days, and I'm sort of tending toward the 2:00 p.m. Eastern Time hour so that I can attract more live listeners. So if you'd like to listen to that, that's sort of my notion of when I'll be doing it. But I do have a life, and so I can't necessarily always guarantee that I will be there. The times that I guarantee are Monday evenings at 8 p.m. and for the advanced group, Wednesday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time on Zoom. So that is the update for tonight, and thank you all for coming tonight. Now all I have to do is find the switch to stop the stream. But anyway, excuse me and good night. Have a good week. Hope to see you next week.